Okay, let's hope this works. Okay.
Hold on 1 second. 1 second.
Yeah.
Recording. Good. All right. We're recording on
All
my
right.
side as a backup. We got you. We're good to go.
Perfect. Okay. So, Matthew, it's been almost exactly a year since we last spoke. It was last October.
Yes.
And last October, we spoke about the evilness of the EU, not the history of the EU.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Today, I asked you, I invited you to talk about, of course, Israel and what's going on. And I've been, we've been hearing a lot. Mainstream media gives us the Israeli and the US perspective, even here in Greece. So I thought, who will I, to whom will I turn to give me the alternative perspective? And of course, I contacted you.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored,
Yeah.
Maria. I hope I do justice to some of the very, very challenging thoughts that we're going to unpack for your audience today. So we'll see what we can do.
Yeah. So please reintroduce yourself for people who haven't watched our first or whatever conversation. You're an amazing from my side. I can tell about you that you are a really diligent researcher, like diligent, and I also enjoy the way you write because you have like an online journal. Is it a journal? Can I
Yeah,
call it a journal?
I guess so. Sure.
Okay. So officially introduce yourself and we'll just dive into the issues.
Okay. So in brief, I am the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot news magazine, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. It's a geopolitical historic analysis website I set up over 10 years ago. And it doesn't just talk about Canada. The idea was to try to fill a vacuum that I saw was a problem in the Canadian news alternative media world, where there was a tendency to either just talk about Canada and or completely misdiagnose what was going on in the world, but no one was properly treating Canada as it is, as a synthetic geopolitical entity created by the British in order to manipulate various operations that were going on far outside of the borders of Canada itself, oftentimes to disrupt potential alliances between Russia and the United States as Arctic partners. That's been unfortunately one of our purposes on the grand chessboard at different times, to play tricks in the banking industry, at other times to assassinate American leaders. Very rarely has our past been something honorable. There have been good moments, but they've been suppressed. So I tried to provide a bit of context and to situate Canada within that broader chemistry. So that was the purpose of that journal. And more recently, with my wife, we co-founded the Rising Tide Foundation, a nonprofit focused on education and culture. And I've co-written with my wife 4 books as well on the clash of the two Americas, going through the origins of the deep state in America, which began far before the age of Donald Trump or Obama, but rather we had to go back to 1776, and even in the most recent volume 4, we had to go back even to the collapsing Roman Republic to give people a better grasp, at least, over the origins of some of the elements of oligarchism that have perverted so much of human history unnecessarily, which then more recently manifested in what today is known as the deep state. But it's so much more intricate than people simplistically refer to it as. And I think with that context, a discussion about the historic and global chemistry and dynamics shaping the region of the Middle East is maybe going to be more fruitful within that space that's being created, that I'm hoping to bring to the discussion. And I know we hammered away at a lot of this last year when we talked about the weird origins of the European Union, and we brought up certain figures like Count Coudenhove Kalergi and his father, who were both very instrumental actually in creating what is known as the state of Israel today as a geopolitical policy. Not so much, they actually were rather anti-Semitic and despised the Jews. But despite that, were
Yeah, it's
devoted,
weird,
as
eh?
were many fascists, to creating a specific geopolitical area where all of the Jews of the world could be put in one place.
Yeah.
So that's also a fascinating anomaly that I think helps to understand today's situation.
Do you think that we should do a brief overview of the state of Israel? Because I think, of course, it's important to, why it's responding the way it's responding today, its origins, how it started, its life. I think it's relevant, very relevant. And also the figures that played a role
Sure,
are
yeah.
relevant.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Mm.
Well, it's important at a time like this that we're living through, where things could spell complete disaster, not just for the Middle East, but for humanity. If anybody loses, I mean, heads are already not cool. People are already losing their heads in craziness over the injustices that are befalling. I will say it, both sides. All right, there's a tendency to want to pick a binary, like I am all for Hamas, or I am all for Israel, and this tendency to fall into this polarization, I think, is a trap, because there are intelligence operations manipulating both
Both
sides.
sides. Yeah.
Yeah. And there are good people within both sides who have been working at different times to try to create durable peace between not just Israel and Palestine, but between Israel, the Jews, and the Arab world more generally. And you'll find that going back through history with an appreciation that there are sane, benevolent, good Muslims, and sane, benevolent, good Jews, and sane, benevolent, good Christians who, whenever they emerge with a bit of political influence, will tend to do things that involve creating durable, like I was mentioning, durable, sustainable peace processes based almost always on economic development, long-term thinking about the next generation of children. So independent of whether the kids of the next generation are Jewish or Muslim, there's an idea that we're all as parents with baggage and hostility that we feel because of the past, that of eye for an eye, vengeance
Yeah.
and vendettas that have been just building up and building up. It's so bad to put. It's hard to put that away. But despite that, people are able to say, like we saw with Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat in 1993, when they signed the Oslo Peace Accords for a two-state solution to recognize Palestine finally as an official nation state, which has still not happened, as well as Israel. And with that idea of two recognized states, there was an idea that Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin had to have economic development give meaning to that otherwise useful but not final deal. Because you need, a friend of mine once said, the Middle East needs water, not Henry Kissinger.
Mm-hmm.
And if you really think about it, there's so many ways to desalinate water from the Mediterranean, to bring that into the entire Middle East, to build projects of 5, 10, 20, 30-year perspectives. And this is what Yitzhak Rabin had requested of the IMF and of specifically the World Bank when he signed that deal, to use, I think it was like $50 million, something significant, to begin a process of infrastructure building with the Palestinians. And there was an emergency meeting and it was rejected. The money was not going to be permitted to do that. And for those who know a little bit of the recent history, they know what happened. Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister of Israel, was assassinated. He was not assassinated by a Muslim terrorist. He was assassinated by a radical Zionist, somebody from a Merkaz, a yeshiva that's associated with the teachings of a radical, I would say, fascist philosopher, a rabbi named Rabbi Kook, who was the first head rabbi under British Mandate Palestine in the 1920s and 30s, and a devoted partner with Vladimir Jabotinsky, the promoter of Greater Israel, which has been a problem. This sect has been behind creating radicalizing yeshivas, kind of like what Zbigniew Brzezinski did with the radicalizing madrasas in the 80s. That would find, young Arab men and then radicalize them with the most regressive interpretation of the Quran that tended to make them inclined to want to go on violent jihad to purge the world of, or especially the Middle East, of infidels, to create a new caliphate. That type of ideology that was brought to us by the CIA, by Zbigniew Brzezinski back in the 70s and 80s as part of a proxy war against
Russia.
Against
Russia.
is to draw the Russians into Afghanistan in a atrophying war, which Zbigniew said was one of the greatest geopolitical plays of his life, even if it meant creating Al-Qaeda. He said it in a 1997 interview with some French magazine. It doesn't matter. I am happy to have had created Al-Qaeda if it meant destroying Russia. And it's like, so that same type of radicalization is the sort of thing with its own more Jewish branding that was put forth in those yeshivas that were promoting the thoughts of Rabbi Kook, of Jabotinsky, or through which this young radical, I will call him a terrorist, assassinated Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, destroying completely that peace process with Arafat, who it seems was likely also poisoned with some radiation poisoning a little bit later. There was something funny about that. But the idea of
Matt, open a parenthesis and tell me, when you say radical Zionist, please give me like a synopsis of what they believe. Radical Zionists. We know Zionists, but if you're a radical Zionist, what more? how much further can you take it?
Yeah, like Yitzhak Rabin would be considered a Zionist. He believed in a homeland for the Jews. He believed in Israel. So he was a good prime minister. That's what a prime minister should do. Yeah. But he believed in coexistence and harmony with your fellow Palestinians and fellow Arabs more generally. He didn't want to. He rejected the idea, as did Yossi Beilin, his justice minister, and as did Shimon Peres for a while. But Shimon Peres got stupid later. They rejected the idea of greater Israel. And so the radical Zionists are more indoctrinated to believe that what currently exists as Israel, as far as the territories are concerned, is insufficient. God actually ordained the chosen people, who are better than everyone else in their interpretation, to have not just what they have now, but all of Palestine.
Yes.
And a big chunk of Turkey, and most of Iraq, and most of Syria, all of Jordan, a big chunk of Egypt. It's a crazy map, but it's a big bite out of the Middle East. That's what they believe is their divine right to control all of that, and that God will not be satisfied with us as Jews. I'm speaking about us Jews, until we purge the land of the infidels and make them subservient as second-class citizens if they're allowed to live.
Yeah, that's what I wanted you basically to mention, that they do base their ideology into, according to me, misinterpret the Bible. So they're basing their ideology to the Bible, the Old Testament, and what God meant for Jews today, and that it's their mission to bring that into fruition, God's plan into fruition.
Yes. And
correct.
You have a lot of these different variations of the same theme across, because a lot of people try to speak of the Jews as if it's one thing, or they speak of Christians as if they're one thing, or the Muslims as if it's one thing, and it's not. There are different, very factionalized groupings within these various Abrahamic faiths, and you'll find that British intelligence has been very good over the centuries at profiling different target cultures and religious groups that you want to influence. So they're very good, very rigorous. It's almost like impressive. It is very impressive how some of these British Orientalists have been able to, go native, as they call it. The Lawrence of Arabias have been able to just go and immerse themselves, or Kim Philby's father was a massively influential Orientalist. But this goes back even into the 18th, 17th centuries, when the British started really getting a hold of India and got their teeth starting to sink into China, you started seeing a big a spike in these Oxford or sometimes Cambridge, but usually Oxford trained intelligence operatives who would go on the ground into Pashtun tribes, into the Bedouin tribes, and know their language and immerse themselves into their folklore and stories and build their trust. But what they were doing, they weren't doing this because they really cared for the different native populations they were going into. No. They were looking for, where are your weak spots in your stories, in your self-identity that can be exploited by the social engineers who are paying them at the end of the day. So there's certain prejudices, like, for example, this is where the British were able to train and employ a certain figure whose name I'm always forgetting, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who is, thank you. He was a figure who was the founder in the 1880s of an interpretation, a way of reading the Quran that he dubbed Salafism. And
what's Salafism? I don't know this term.
It's kind of like a variation of what is also known as Wahhabism. It's it tends to be Sunni, but it's not. It doesn't represent Sunniism either. And it basically is a way of emphasizing all of the elements of radical jihadism, and that tend to promote a self-identity of superiority complex over infidels who are inferior to you in ontologically, kind of like the way you could see as a radical Zionist reading the chosen people stories and all of a sudden getting that same sense of, I am thus superior ontologically over every other human that exists, right? And then that becomes something that is conducive to fascism, to having you want to manage fascist type governments that suppress or keep people in a slave-like servitude under you. And it's also useful to promote violence, to take land from people who are inferior, because if they're inferior to you, why should they control the land that is your divine right to own? So both of them, by the British having amplified and promoted both of these ideologies, it creates a wonderful formula for the British. And I'm talking about 19th century British, but even to this very day, there's still evidence of British intelligence and American intelligence, but the British are always there, amplifying, as we saw with even Hamas, which, keep in mind, Hamas, I'm not saying Hamas is ISIS. I'm not saying that. They are, however, an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood. That is one thing. Ron Paul, a former congressman, gave a very solid speech about a decade ago in Congress. It's gone viral as a video now. People can watch it on YouTube. And he made the point that Hamas was largely created as an Anglo-American operation with the help of the Israelis to counteract the influence of Arafat, who is the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So you have this more radicalized, violence-oriented grouping that was created, promoted after the first and second Intifadas against Arafat. Why? Well, look at what Arafat was doing. He was able to think on the same harmonic terms as Yitzhak Rabin, and was not inclined to fall into these dualisms. So we have more recently, I wrote this down actually, WikiLeaks as a useful thing just to help people depolarize themselves and think about the British hand manipulating all sides. Britain created the state of Israel. We can go into that in later on in our discussion today. They created the House of Saud, the state of Saudi Arabia in 1926. Yeah. Israel was right. So they created a variety of these apparently rival factions within the Middle East. They also created the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, as I mentioned from this guy, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, is the intellectual founder of what became the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, and he was being paid for by the British Cairo office. And the actual founder was a disciple of al-Afghani named Hassan al-Banna. And al-Banna was also was given money to found the Muslim Brotherhood by the British Suez Company before it was nationalized by Gamal Nasser. It was British run that ran the Suez Canal for like 60 years, and they gave him the money to found the Muslim Brotherhood, which was, again, a useful piece of the recipe book to create constant turmoil and chaos, with one side of violent Israeli settlers who would break treaties, go in, do very bad things to Arabs living already on the land that they wanted for themselves under the influence of people like Rabbi Cook and his yeshivas. And then inversely, you would have the Muslim Brotherhood promoted responses or sometimes instigations against the invaders. And this would then just create foreseeably multi-generational hostility. Now, Hamas emerged out of the Muslim Brotherhood. They got a lot of support when Morsi was in power. And the Muslim Brotherhood, not only were they banned, keep this in mind for people listening, they were banned by Gamal Nasser. They tried killing him a couple of times, probably more than a couple. He survived. He banned them after he nationalized the Suez Canal and from Egypt. But they continued to go underground. They were continuously interfacing and receiving support by British intelligence, often through Freemasonic operations. A lot of this came out of British Freemasonic outfits built up across the Middle East. A lot of them were receiving support by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin, who was installed there by the British and maintained his influence as the voice of the Muslim people, which he did not represent. Most Muslim people didn't like him. They hated him, but he kept on getting support by the British for the entire time, including the time he worked with the Nazis and was assigned to try to make the Muslim world become pro-Nazi during World War II. But he continued after that. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood eventually killed the guy who replaced Nasser. Anwar Sadat was assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood.
Why?
I think he was certainly
Not
as
radical
wise.
enough.
He wasn't radical enough. He was inclined towards modernization. He was not as good as Nasser, but he was inclined towards wanting to industrialize and modernize Egypt with other nations adjacent to Egypt, which was antithetical, I think, to those who were managing the terrorist activity of the Arab world at the time, who wanted to use the terrorists, kind of like the Mongols were used by the Venetians a 1,000 years earlier, as marcher lords to destroy advanced civilization. That's the idea. Is you just you create an ideological cult movement, you grow it until it does what it does. It just knows how to destroy, and that's all. And so you can then direct this giant monstrosity to go and raze to the ground beautiful advanced cities that you want to destroy in Baghdad, which they did with the Mongols in the 12th and 13th, 14th centuries. You do that with Russia all the way. The Mongols almost under Ogedai Khan almost took control of Europe as we know it, right? And it was just because of the death of Ogedai that they didn't go further than Hungary and had to return to figure out who the new Khan was going to be. But the Venetians were there the whole time. They were the only power of Europe allowed full access to all trade within Mongol-controlled territories. And it was Venetian advisors who were advising the Khans, like Marco Polo. Marco Polo's father were leading advisors to the Khan, providing Venetian intelligence, money, funding, kind of like what the MI6 or CIA has been doing to ISIS or Al-Qaeda in more recent ages. It's not that different, really. It's kind of, I have to laugh a little bit because it's like, it's
History
kind of
repeating
smart.
itself. It's,
Yeah, it is.
it's a
So
system that worked. And since it worked, they keep
yeah,
repeating
they're
it.
going
Yeah,
to do it
exactly.
again. And it's not that creative because it's really the same recipe book with very little rebranding. And I'm saying that stuff about Hamas because I really wanted to get across WikiLeaks. So WikiLeaks in 2008, there was a release of correspondences between the chief of Israeli intelligence, who at the time was named Amos Yadlin, a general. He was the head of Israeli intelligence, and the U.S. ambassador at the time, whose name was Richard Jones. They were corresponding, and in these WikiLeaks, this 2007 or 8, I might have been 2007. Yadlin is telling the U.S. ambassador how much he hopes and prays to God that Hamas becomes the dominant political party in Palestine, which happens. There's an election, and that's what happens. Yeah. Why? Why would this guy want the enemy group who tried to destroy and disrupt Yasser Arafat the same way these radical rabbinical yeshivas tried to disrupt Yitzhak Rabin? Why would this Israeli want Hamas to be the dominant grouping who's so antagonistic to Israel's very existence. It's because he's part of this ideology that wants an excuse to purge the land of Arabs and take control of the zone. They want the violence. They want Israelis to be murdered. That's the thing. And so that's also the sort of thing we could see today, where high Egyptian officials have made it known that 10 days before this current Hamas attack on October 7th, they were already warning, Egypt officials were warning Israel, look, we have intelligence that this is going to happen. You should do something. And Israel did less than nothing.
Okay, before we get there, before we get there, I just wanted to comment on how difficult the situation has been in the Middle East since the beginning. Because as you made me understand, I knew it, but you described it very, very, very well. We have two groups on the opposite side from one another, but they basically have the same ideology. I'm talking about the extremists. Yeah. So the extreme Jews believe that they are God's chosen people and they should dominate the area. And then on the other side, on the opposite side, we have the extreme Muslims, the radicals, that they believe that they are superior to everybody else, and they should eradicate every human being that is not Muslim from the area, which is almost impossible to bring a balance and peace with, because you have two radicals who have exactly the same ideology, exactly the same. No, we will survive and you will die. No, we will survive and you will die. Well, good luck. What do you do with that? It's impossible.
It's impossible. It's a recipe book for Armageddon. It's a recipe
book for constant war. Constant.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And so the pain, the painful, there's many reasons why this is all very painful, but one of the things that gets me as far as classical tragedy is concerned is that what makes classical tragedy powerful, it's that
I'm Greek. I'll tell you. Tell me.
Oh, you're great. Okay, well, what's your view? What's your
the drama?
The drama.
No, it's the drama. It speaks to it. Every tragedy speaks to a human condition. That draws you into it, and you sympathize and you leave the drama. It's the drama. You leave the drama.
Yeah, it's cathartic. You're seeing a little bit of yourself on the stage of.
They used it as psychotherapy back then, theater.
Yeah, and they should still do it today. I mean,
sorry, not just psychotherapy. It wasn't just therapeutic. It was also to make the masses. Give me a moment to find the right words for this. Like a hypnotic situation. So, wars are going on. Political things and schemes are going on in your, in your systems. But no, don't deal with these things. Go and see the, in the theater,
the bread and circuses kind of, but
yes, it had this also. They use it like that.
That's the powerful thing with entertainment is it could be I think it's actually one of the most principled battlefields for human freedom in the world is located in the domain of the arts, because it's in that place that you could do really such a powerful evil or a powerful good can be done in that place where you're like bypassing the domain of pure logic, which is where our sentinels are always kind of like are diligent, and you're just bypassing that, going straight to the heart in the form of
the emotion. Yeah.
But you're doing it in a way which acts upon the deeper, subtle, both conscious but also a lot of the unconscious forces within the psyche and within the zeitgeist, which if you're a lover of humanity and you've tapped into your creative reason in an advanced manner, you could do that in a way that amplifies people's agapic, like the best divine parts of them can be amplified while at the same time educating their reason about lessons that are very important about human nature, politics, history, where they feel like they're changing in the audience while the play is happening, because the play is not so much about something other than them, but it's about ultimately them. So when you see like a Hamlet just being he's got all this great potential to be this wonderful, important leader who's so desperately needed in Denmark at a time when Denmark is under siege from Fortinbras, who's from another kingdom, who's potentially going to take over Denmark. There's no leadership. His father was probably killed by his uncle, who's now married his mother. You know, the girl who loves him devotedly doesn't understand why he's losing his head, and he's seeing things, but he's got this wonderful good side about him too, that you're like, wow, you with a leader like with your insight and creative passion, this could really save the day. But he can't get out of his ego pain and all of the worst elements of his paranoia redirect his genius towards revenge. And by the end of it, he doesn't just get revenge. Everybody dies. The girl who loves him, her father, his mother, the guy who probably killed his uncle, who probably killed his father. And then Denmark is just taken over, right? With no fight. Fortinbras just walks right in and he's like, what the hell's going on? Everybody's dead. I thought I was going to have to do a fight. They killed themselves. And the audience should have experienced in that process cathartically, like a little bit of the elements that made Hamlet tragic inside of them, where they hopefully won't make similar kinds of ego driven mistakes, and they're also more appreciative to the elements of what makes court intrigue function, whether for good or for bad. So you know, you've got this today. Israel was probably, or the Middle East was probably, before October 7th, never in such a positive place for peace. And I say this because what did you have before October 7th? You had in the last couple of months, there's been a high acceleration of BRICS, the BRICS plus, the BRICS being the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa alliance, has now, they successfully grew to have the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia and Argentina all join, which will happen in January of 2024 if the world has not been blown up. So with that comes the BRICS Development Bank, alternative lending mechanisms outside of the influence of the IMF or World Bank that are going to be playing a bigger and bigger role in funding the development aspirations of nations that have been kept from accessing real development over the past 80 years. And you know, with this, we have a normalization of relations with Israel. So begun with the Abraham Accords under Trump, that was 2019. The momentum was put into motion for the Arab states to begin to finally recognize the state of Israel, which has not happened. And now they were all announcing they were going to do it. Israeli relations were being normalized with Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Egypt, many other countries were all doing the same thing, which would make now economic investments in the region possible for the first time. Because if you have high volatility, there's not a lot of willingness to invest in things that might take 5 or 10 years. So now all of a sudden that was there. There were a lot of groupings within Israel. I mean, it's a tech hub. There's a lot of technical expertise within Israel. A lot of science, a lot of things like that are not just experimental pharmaceutical products. There's actually useful things that Israeli does too, which we're very much looking forward to cooperating on the Middle East branches of the Belt and Road Initiative. There's a lot of support for that on a variety of different groupings within Israel, who wanted to build infrastructure that would then also revive what the Yitzhak Rabin Arafat orientation was doing back in the 90s. That was potentially happening. You also had what's known as the so Syria also was had Bashar al-Assad and his wife had just returned back to Damascus a few weeks ago from Beijing, where they signed a ton of economic deals, and Syria is a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. There was a discussion for building the 5 Cs vision that would involve Turkey, Syria, all of the different adjacent countries to connect rail from the Mediterranean, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, Red Sea, and I'm missing one, around industrial corridors that would have tied into also the North-South Development Corridor, which has been accelerating over the past 3 years, especially. That's from the Russian Arctic, a 8,000-kilometer rail corridor down into India, well, to the ports of Iran in the south, in the Gwadar port and Chabahar port, and that would then continue down into India. So it's a deal with Chad. About 12 countries sign on. It passes right through Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, with branches down into Turkey, into Israel, into that's also been moving fast in a very good way.
Matt, sorry.
Yes.
When you say that different groupings within Israel were for all these, connections, let's say, the official government, was it for or against?
Well, here's the weird thing. So there has been a lot of effort on the part of the Chinese and Putin to organize Benjamin Netanyahu to go along with this new game in town. Like,
Did he?
look, Benjamin Netanyahu, in my assessment, is a complex character, more so than people realize. I used to think of him as a one-dimensional Greater Israel fanatic only, and that's all he is. And he is that. He is that. And his father was the personal assistant to Jabotinsky, and he was calling for the murder of Yitzhak Rabin in the 90s. So he is that. Don't get me wrong. But there's an element of something else that I think has been over years and years of effort by the Russians, especially, and the Chinese, to organize a bit of reason, rationality, to get him to think about the Belt and Road as something that could allow for benefits to Israel that would be greater than burning or creating World War III in that zone to rebuild Temple Mount and the Third Temple of Solomon, which is also what his followers, many of them, including probably himself, also desire. Yeah. One thing that you got to keep in mind is that I've noticed this probably went on before 2009, but I noticed that starting in 2009 is the earliest I can find it, a discussion between various Muslim imams and certain rabbis, Sanhedrin rabbis in Israel, to create a third temple of Solomon, which would involve doing it peacefully. And people would be like, how is that possible? Because as far as most people are aware, including myself up until recently, the only way that the third temple could be built on the Temple Mount location, which is where the Knights Templar had their headquarters, right, doing their Baphomet worship, overseeing the Crusades. The only way that could happen is that what currently exists there is the Holy of Holies of the Muslim world has to be destroyed. And then once it's destroyed, which would be like war with the Muslim world, then you could somehow have a space to build the Solomon's temple. That would be like, and then the Messiah will apparently comes according to this Kabbalistic like interpretation of the Torah, which it doesn't say any of that. Now, this discussion that I've noticed that began in 2009, but it was again probably before that, was based on certain rabbis saying, well, look, nowhere does it say that the temple has to be rebuilt exactly on the location where the Holy of Holies currently exists. We can do it according to Scripture next door. Yeah, and we could do it in a way that involves peacefully rebuilding it, so that the extreme religious Zionists will be satisfied in their heart that they've done what Scripture told them to do, right? Because it's hard when you have like somebody who's really like I don't want to use this charged language, who's really, really, really religiously devoted to this idea of prophecy. It's hard to diffuse that. So you can satisfy it according to this interpretation, but in a manner that doesn't involve all out jihad with the infidels.
Now, I can't see that would work.
I don't see it as a bystander looking at it from the outside. I don't see it either, but I try to put myself in the shoes of like a Russian or Chinese grand strategist, because they're on the inside, they're in the corridors of power, they're the ones brokering peace deals, and I try to pull that exercise off as best as I can. And I know that from the writings I've read from Chinese policymakers, as well as Saudi policymakers and Russian policymakers on this issue over the years, this is the way that they've chosen to look at it, is looking for the reasonable actors that they can provide incentives to in Saudi Arabia, from the case of Russians and especially Chinese, to say, okay, get rid of your Wahhabite support for radical fanatics that you've been funding under the control of Britain and the USA since the 20s. Just get rid of that. Stop doing that, and we will make it worth your while. You will make a lot of money and have your security better maintained by building high-speed rail with the help of China, and have nuclear power with the help of Russia and China and other nations. Through Saudi Arabia, and UAE will benefit, and you can connect that down into Yemen, which is where the peace deal with Saudi Arabia and Yemen was created, was by the idea that, look, we can all develop ourselves together, even though we've been fighting each other brutally for 7 years. We can now pull back and start building infrastructure, and we can connect that rail down into Djibouti and Ethiopia, which there's been a corridor connecting on the Horn of Africa, right, Yemen to Djibouti, which would go through the Chinese funded rail networks that have been built up in the last 5-6 years all across Africa.
Do you have a map with the rail?
From Egypt? Sorry,
the plan.
Saudi
The
Arabia?
Plan. It's not built
can...
yet, but what's the plan? So we can see which countries will be connected.
Yeah, let me pull up an article I did here. Can you see my screen right now?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, let me see if this article. I wrote this article for the Cradle some months back, and here is what Saudi Arabia is building. It's a 2,400 kilometer high-speed rail corridor stretching across from Bahrain all the way to Mecca and Medina. There's discussion also, not even discussion, it's already being built from the UAE down from Bahrain into Oman, which in all cases would connect down into Yemen. The already existing blue line here in Addis Ababa to Djibouti was completed in 2017. And there has been, around the time that Bashar al-Assad's 5C's Vision project was overthrown and Gaddafi was killed in 2010, there was at that time a major push by certain Saudi companies to build a bridge, a massive bridge with rail, highways, and pipelines between Africa and Yemen, with new cities being created on either side of what's called the bridge of the Horn of Africa.
Okay.
Where there's a lot of poverty.
And then that part would be connected with the rest of the rail?
Yeah, exactly. And then here, let me show you another image. Africa, New Silk Road. I think I probably have it here. Do I have it? I don't have it here. Yeah, there's basically oh, here, 1 second. Let me no, the images are broke. Well, there you can sort of see it. Here's the Bashar al-Assad 5C's Vision, at least a part of it, that connects from Aleppo down into Latakia ports, into Beirut and Lebanon, that could go down into Saudi Arabia, into Israel, as well as different branches of rail that are some of them are already being built. Like in the Baghdad, there's a Iraqi-Iran rail connection that would be connecting down to Pakistan that's being built up that would tie into this. And there's all of the water projects you have to keep in mind that would unite all of these regions together.
The water project.
Yeah, there's a lot of water projects. Like you have in Northern Africa, you have a water project, or several water projects that are going to be built that are tied to nuclear power. Oh, here's one. So here's the Libyan water project that was destroyed by NATO's destruction of Libya back in 2011. There's a discussion. Yeah, that was going to call for taking underwater, the fresh water under the aquifers under the Sahara Desert, and move a lot of that water to the surface and create new forests, new agricultural regions.
Yeah,
a lot. But there's also nuclear energy development in Egypt currently being built up, the Sana nuclear reactors with the help of Russia, which also allows not just for energy for industrial use and civilian use, but also for desalinating lots of salt water from the Mediterranean which would be needed to be a part of a desert reclamation program of greening and creating agricultural regions outside of the dependency on the Nile River, which is the only freshwater source for Egypt, which is also the creative certain the basis of conflict between Egypt and their neighbors in Sudan, and especially in Ethiopia, which is also building one of the biggest dams that's nearly completely finished, called the Grand Renaissance Dam at this moment. So this was something that was a project Mubarak, who was again an enemy of the Muslim Brotherhood, was supporting, was desalinating water from the Mediterranean. That was stopped just at the same time that Gaddafi's water project was stopped, and the Five Seas Vision, which is, oh, it's not here. The Bashar al-Assad Five Seas Vision was stopped in 2010, 11, 12 with the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a George Soros CIA-funded color revolution. It was not an authentic Arab Spring, obviously. And out of that came the Muslim Brotherhood domination of Egypt under Morsi, which also gave rise to a vast expansion of Hamas activities, because Hamas is tied to Muslim Brotherhood. And that then created more of a basis of excuses for Israeli settlers and others to feel hostility towards the Palestinian Gaza Strip Arabs. And again, it was all part of that same mess. So with China coming in, with Russia as well, providing a security support, but also this economic incentive, all of these projects and discussions were being revived around the Belt and Road Initiative and the North-South Transportation Corridor and many other things associated with that. And that's really what people have to hold in mind, I think. What they want to understand, what is really driving the war between Israelis and Palestinians at this moment, they have to remove their minds from that simple little location and look at this broader dynamic of peace, of functional peace that would have happened were it not for stupid people being little Hamlets, arrogant little selfish, bigoted fools, undermining all of this.
Matt, explain to me why China, and the rest of the countries, but primarily China. What's her bid? What is she stand to gain from helping Middle East and connecting Middle East with Ethiopia specifically and Africa?
It seems.
What is she gaining out of this, China?
Well, it's like looking at China's philosophy is important. I mean, it's a 5,000-year-old civilization, probably older, that has a deep-rooted Confucian philosophy and meritocracy that's been maintaining itself for a long time. And when you look at China, you read Confucius, you read Mencius, you read Shunxi, some of these great, really influential philosophers who've shaped the Chinese worldview and philosophy and how they think of themselves, how they think of their idea of self-interest. It's very different from a lot of the influential philosophers who have contaminated the thinking of the Western world for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. We've got good philosophers too, don't get me wrong. We got wonderful philosophers in the West, but we got some really bad, toxic thinkers who have been put into our education system that have influenced our habits of thought and feelings, like Thomas Hobbes, like the social Darwinists and all of the outgrowths that came out of them, that all defined the idea of personal self-interest as being tied to my ability to beat the weaker, right? To impose my will to power onto those weaker around me. That's my self-interest. It's very much based upon a certain philosophy that we live in a zero-sum game, that everything is just a war of each against all in a world of diminishing resources, and those who survive are those who have the power to destroy the weaker, undermine through deceit or other things, which becomes a virtue. Kind of like what Plato was refuting with Callicles in the Gorgias. Like Callicles represents some of the worst elements of Thomas Hobbes in our modern age. The greatest good is the ability to satisfy your growing impulses and fleshly pleasures and destroy your enemies. That's the greatest good, and the greatest evil is trying to be a good person because you're weak, and there's no such thing as conscience. So these radical materialist ideas became very hegemonic, especially through the British Empire's influence over the world. But even before that, the Venetian Empire was animated by these things. And so this gave birth to a lot of very vicious imperialism that did a lot of damage. China doesn't have a history of empire. I mean, if you go back, try to find examples over the last several thousand years of China going and subduing weaker nations around them. You don't find it. It's not there. Every time that they've gone outside of themselves over from the first Silk Road in 200 BC when it was created, and look at how that Silk Road, which created trade corridors from China to Europe to the old Roman Republic through the Middle East, and also maritime corridors to Africa, to Ethiopia, where there was great advanced civilizations across a lot of Africa that have been wiped out by British and other Western imperialists over the last 150 years. They wiped the memory that there were ever these advanced African civilizations because they want the Africans to have an identity of subservience and slavery. That's the way, So, but China didn't think that way. They went in. They didn't bring in weapons. They didn't dominate anybody. They brought in trade. They brought in silk. They got in return resources. Giraffes. For the Chinese courts, and that's always been the sort of philosophical identity of the Chinese. It's more like reasonable self-interest, that your self-interest is better maintained when you're in a happy community that's in peace. That's just, it doesn't mean that they're angels. It just means that you're going to be able to benefit by having customers outside of your zone of influence within China that are not dead. If your customers aren't dead, you'll do better business. If they're improving their life because of things that you've done to assist them in improving their conditions, they will be able to consume the goods you produce better because they're living longer. They have more purchasing power in the Arab world, so they will buy your goods, which is good for your business. They will produce better finished goods that they can do if they have industries in Syria or in Africa that you could buy for your market in China. And that's the way the US or even in Europe at different times of the past, we had leaders who thought like that, but they usually would get assassinated, like John F. Kennedy, or like there's a lot. There's a big list.
I find it I understand exactly what you're saying about China's history and philosophical like background, but what's the word, foundation. But especially the last century, China also has been hugely tainted by the British and the US. They have, their tentacles all over China. It's hard for me to believe that China has not been affected, even philosophically and politically, by the US and the British.
Oh yeah, China has a deep state. There's a British directed deep state operation inside of China. Yeah, every nation has a deep state, for sure. And in fact, my wife and I we did a documentary.
Your wife is Chinese, correct?
She's half Chinese. Yeah, her family.
Chinese.
Yeah, her mother's side of the family came from Hong Kong.
Okay.
The documentary that we did last 8 months ago was called How China Kicked Out George Soros in 1989.
I haven't watched that. Where can we watch that?
Oh yeah, it's very easy to find on CanadianPatriot.org. That's my main website.
Yeah.
You'll find like a little. Oh yeah, it's worth it. It's only 25 minutes, and we go through that story pretty quickly. We within that we get across where did the deep states come from inside of China. We could have gone further into the century of humiliation. We could have done that, but I mean, we wanted to keep it within 30 minutes. So there's things we had to leave out. The century of humiliation, of course, was, for those who don't know, I'm sure you know, but people watching may not know, it was the century that China found itself the target of the opium trade, launched and run by the Anglo-American leading families, especially the British East India Company, but a lot of the American, British allied Wall Street families of the Eastern establishment, what are known as the Boston Brahmins, the Cabot's Lodges, Delano's, like a lot of these leading families that got their wealth in the early 1800s in America were always loyal to the British High Command. And they made a fortune pumping opium from India into China, and also from Turkey. That was a hub at the time. And China was just It wasn't to make money. At the end of the day, money was made by corrupt people. Organized crime syndicates were created as well. But that wasn't really the purpose. The purpose, as the British understood it from the First and the Second Opium Wars, was to spiritually destroy the
Yeah.
dangerous Chinese dragon. The emergence of and China, if you go back to the 1790s, the two biggest economic powerhouses of the world were not Britain. It was not anything in Europe or the USA. It was number one, China, number two, India, by a long shot. And then further down the scale, then you had like Great Britain and other European and USA was irrelevant at the time. So that had to be destroyed. How did they do that? Well, the British went into India to capture it, and that became the crown jewel. Part of the capturing of India involved crushing, breaking them. Like you would beat a slave who has too much desire for freedom. You got to beat the slave, make an example. They did that with India, and they cut off the hands of literally tens of thousands of Indian textile workers, because India was the world's primary textile production center, high quality mass production. Very advanced civilization in India, with Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims coexisting in relative harmony. That had to be destroyed. So the British, they destroyed museums, they destroyed cultural centers in India, they stole what they could to fill the British Museum, and they cut off the hands of the textile workers and broke all the machinery, leaving India with a lot of debt, a bunch of puppet leaders controlled by the British Raj, and opium. So they had a good climate to grow opium. And now Britain said, okay, well, we'll take that opium. And now that Britain has control of the monopoly over textiles, that's what, the Manchester industrial forces became, primary producers of. And so they said, okay, well, we're going to take that and we're going to start stuffing it. We're going to sell it to the Chinese. And the Chinese got more addicted, the youth, but also the administrators of the bureaucracy got addicted. And through that addiction came corruption. All of a sudden, you created a very vast organized crime under the control of British Freemasonic agencies that had been set up around China's perimeter. And after the first Opium War, when an emperor said, no more of this, his son, I think, had an overdose or something from opium. And he said, no more. They banned it. And the British came with warships saying, okay, it's free trade or it's war. Because free trade says no protectionism, no nationalism to defend your people. It's free trade. That's the rule of the seas. And the Chinese said no. They got decimated over 3 years of war, and Britain got control of Hong Kong, Shanghai. They got control of everything. And the opium just flowed until a second time happened in the 1850s, where China said no again. That was the second Opium War. They got really subdued at that point. And there were certain agreements again where Britain would extend its control of Hong Kong for a century. And China was so that's the thing. You had the triads were created under this time by the British Freemasonic outfits. They created the Chinese triads that were always local, kind of like what Mayor Lansky or Bronfman or the organized crime syndicates of the Corsican or Sicilian mafia in America. They were always under the control of Freemasonic agencies that would use the organized crime networks as part of the geopolitical battle plan to maintain a global narcotics culture, but also carry out assassinations, other things. But
Yeah.
Allen Dulles, British intelligence, were always supporting this whole thing. This goes back to Giuseppe Mazzini, right? And Lord Palmerston's operations of the young Italy movement in the 1840s and 50s and 60s. It's the same thing. It was directly tied to it, actually. So I'm saying all of this just for a matter of context over China, right? So that was called the Century of Humiliation. Eventually, due to the complete incompetence and corruption of the Qing dynasty, there were small efforts to reform it, but it was too little, too late in the 1890s. The Sun Yat-sen came about as a leading revolutionary who was a follower of Abraham Lincoln, had studied in Hawaii, had become a Christian, and he led a revolution to overthrow the hereditary powers of the Qing dynasty and create the first Republic of China in 1911. He did that. When you read Sun Yat-sen's writings, who was only president for a couple of months, and then he abdicated for political reasons, and a warlord came in who was pro-British. And that warlord did damage, but the warlord luckily also died of, I think, over drinking or something. and and some of that damage was mitigated, but it was still a chaotic situation of, like, China was a third world country. There was not a lot, no industry to speak of, nothing. And there was cannibalism. There was actually cannibalism all across China for a lot of this period. Sun Yat-sen was a great leader, a brilliant grand strategist, but he died too soon. Whether he was poisoned, I have no idea. They say it was liver cancer. I have no idea. But he died in 25. And he had a whole vision for what's called the International Development Project for China. It's a book he wrote with engineering studies over building rail and hydroelectric dams on the Yangtze River. He had the whole thing figured out. I read the book. I wrote a report on it. It's a wonderful thing, and he had a lot of allies, even amongst the new Communist Party. And there were just like in the case of Russia's Bolsheviks, it was a mixed bag. You had the like in the case, because they're both happening at the same time, right? You have the Wall Street London oligarchs funding Bolshevik color revolutionaries to overthrow the Romanovs in Russia. You had them doing similar things inside of like anarchist movements across Europe. A lot of the anarchist international was actually centered in London, which was where a lot of the headquarters of these groups in Serbia, in like the Serbian Black Hand, had operations that were heavily influenced within London. So London had sort of like a network of where all of the anarchist movements are, who are the leaders on the payroll of British intelligence, which worked very closely with the Okhrana Russian intelligence, which also worked very closely with certain deep state operators in France with the French intelligence. A lot of them had overlaps with the occult, with theosophists like Madame Blavatsky's networks were very, very active in all of these intelligence hubs. They were creating things like the protocols of Zion were actually created by the Russian Okhrana and the French branch in order to influence the Tsar, who was a soft-minded fool, not a bad guy, but soft-minded, who believed in his flatterers, the Iagos. He had a lot of Iagos whispering in his ear all around him, to convince him that the one man who would have saved Russia at the time was Count Sergei Witte, who was an admirer, just like Sun Yat-sen, of Abraham Lincoln and the American system program, who brought that into Russia to develop the Trans-Siberian Railway and protective tariffs to stop the dumping of cheap goods from abroad. That Sergei Witte, who was the grand strategist working with Otto von Bismarck and his French colleagues around Sidi Carnot and his Chinese colleagues who were trying to reform the Qing dynasty, this Sergei Witte was using money, and the Count Tsar Nicholas II was being told, look, everybody loves Sergei Witte, the Count, who's also becoming the first prime minister of Russia. He's a Rothschild Jewish banker stooge. He's trying to subvert you, Tsar Nicholas II. And they worked him into an anti-Semitic paranoid prejudice, and Count Tsar Nicholas II was like, look, this is my most important administrator. Can anybody prove that what you're saying is true? And then so somebody says, yes, we found it. It's the protocols of Zion. We found it. Look, they talk about it. They're plotting Jewish Masonic conspiracy to take over the world, and Count Sergei Witte is their Russian
the
puppet.
author, yes.
And he fired him. He fired Count Witte. And as soon as Count Witte was gone, vacuum of leadership, just like what happened when Otto von Bismarck was fired for similar reasons. Because stupid Kaiser Wilhelm, a cousin of Nicholas II, both, grandchildren of Queen Victoria, had stupid idiot. He believed in the Iagos of the German court, telling him, look, Otto von Bismarck is trying to steal your sunshine. He's a Rothschild stooge, don't you know? And so he fired Otto von Bismarck for the same reasons. And with the vacuum of leadership, all of a sudden, the pathway to World War I was guaranteed. And also in the case of Russia, without Sergei Witte, who was doing economic reforms massively in 1904, 1905, when he was made first prime minister, that was necessary. If he had been allowed to continue the industrial reforms that he was doing,
they couldn't have the revolution because people would have a job, money, and live happily.
Exactly. Nobody wants to overthrow a government if they can eat. That only works if they're in poverty. So they had to get rid of Witte, and also the Jewish pogroms, because in Russia, because of the protocols of Zion paranoia, the Tsar endorsed the creation of these Jewish pogroms to put the Jews into these very like little ghettos in Russia where they lived in scarcity, starved to death. It was like really bad. And there were like riots, lynch mobs across Russia to kill Jews. This was happening also in France with the same time. 1896 was the time you had the Dreyfus affair of the French soldier that was falsely condemned for treason in France, and he was Jewish. And so this was used to promote anti-Semitism in France. And a lot of the later Vichy French government that worked with the Nazis were those young anti-Jewish lynch mobbers of the 1890s who wanted to like kill all the Jews and break their store shop windows in France. So there was like this bubbling, everybody was like, that was the popular thing. If you were like Lord Milner, Lord Balfour, the guys who wrote the Balfour Accords to create a homeland for the Jews, they were anti-Semitic. They hated the Jews. They loved fascism. That was their thing. They did the most with Lloyd George, the prime minister, the Nazi prime minister of Great Britain, to support the growth of Nazism. And they're the ones who are saying, no, God wants a homeland for all of the scattered Jews of the world to go into this one little geopolitically convenient area that can be lit on fire in forever instability. No, I'm sorry. It's like, so this is the thing. All of this was being set up, and I'm saying all of this to get across China, right? So I didn't forget your question. So China, the Bolsheviks, on the one hand, were primarily a hodgepodge of a variety of groups that had been abused and were poor, but led by certain agents that were very aware of what they were a part of. And I would put amongst the top of that list, Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was a high-level controller who interfaced very closely with Jacob Schiff, who major banker who was behind the growth of the Federal Reserve, Bernard Baruch, the Warburgs, Lord Milner, who was also writing the Balfour Accords, was also bankrolling the Bolsheviks through the round. He was the head of the Round Table movement at the time. So you had Trotsky, who was like one of the key money bags, arranging things. Lenin seems to at the time have been a mixed bag. He was, I think, more. Anyway, that's a whole difficult topic. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around Lenin, exactly where he stood on that spectrum. But what you had once the Bolsheviks took over and the Romanovs were eliminated, you had a power play. The Trotskyists were the golden boys. They were the ones that the Anglo-American elite really wanted to be in
power,
the power position forever. And why? It's because, well, Trotsky oversaw what was known as the New Economy Policy. The New Economy Policy in 1922-23, when Trotsky was running the industrial and scientific program of Russia, he was like the science czar and industrial czar. People forget this. The New Economy Policy was essentially perestroika of the 1990s Russia in the 1920s. It was total liberalization, privatization. Western bankers like Armand Hammer, who is known as Lenin's banker, came in with was it Continental Petroleum, or I forget, Oriental Petroleum, and just bought up most of Russia's economy. The whole thing was a transfer of wealth to foreign powers, foreign bankers, which is what was the 20s Russia. And then you had certain nationalists who didn't want to go along with the destruction of Russia. Trotsky also was pro-Nazi. He was pro-fascist. He was working with those same like Leo Amory, Milner pro-fascist networks in Britain, in America, that were promoting fascism. In Germany, you had alliances between the Trotskyists and the Nazi apparatus, as well as the Japanese fascists on the Eastern Front of Russia. So Trotsky's part of his thing was to create, to reduce Russia, to give total independence to the different and support the growth of pro-fascist ethno-nationalist movements in Ukraine, in Latvia, and other ethno-nationalist regions of the Russian periphery. That they were all going to be made independent according to the constitution that he fought to create, Russia was going to be highly subdued. He was going to be the leader of like what Gorbachev or Yeltsin was going to be the leader of in Russia, was, you know, a local warlord controlling a region that would be a slave state under the influence of foreign technocratic powers. That's what Putin subverted later on. Because if Yeltsin and Gorbachev, if that plan had maintained itself, that's what Russia was, and it would have just been destroyed by now. It probably would be, according to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who wrote The Grand Chessboard in 1997, about 12 or 13 micro federations with, you know, Russia has like 89 ethnicities. Each one would be given their own little micro territory. Divide to conquer. And that's what probably Russia would be today. There would be no Russia. And the same thing, they've been looking at China in a similar angle. So in the case of Russia, there was a fight. Trotsky was kicked out. The nationalists tended to organize Stalin. Stalin came out, fortunately, in many ways, as the person who was in a dominant position, who went to war with the Trotskyists and started an effort to rehabilitate and save Russia. And this is where, you know, there's been it's difficult to talk about this because here in the West, over the last, especially since the Cold War, there's been the most intensive revisionist history sponsored by the British Empire and all of their associated historians, including historians within Russia, to paint Stalin as if he was worse than Hitler. And so it's difficult to speak the way I'm speaking because I know there's so many mental triggers in so many of the Western audience out there when they just hear this type of language. But I'm telling you, I used to feel this way too. I thought that Stalin was probably at least as bad as Hitler. That's what I thought for a long time until I started reading the writings of people like Grover Furr, who's an amazing researcher who did incredible. I bought most of his books where he's gone through the archives of the Kremlin archives, the KGB archives. He's looked at the evidence. And most of what we've been told negatively about Stalin, I won't say Stalin's an angel. He did bad things, as did everybody during the Cold War. But most of the worst things we were told about Stalin, he didn't do. It's actually a lie that's been created. The Moscow trials, there's actual evidence that those Moscow trials were not just him destroying his political enemies. There really was a conspiracy in 1933, 34 to kill Stalin, bring in a pro-Nazi government. That was the thing, run by Trotsky, who at this point was in exile, bouncing around the world in Mexico, and he had a whole network of deep state operatives inside of Russia that had to be purged. But again, a lot of evidence, it does exist, was brought to the surface. A lot of these confessions were not make-believe confessions. It was real.
So he didn't starve millions of people?
No, Holodomor, I wrote actually a chapter in one of my books going through Holodomor, that story that's been popularized by Hollywood movies and other things, and has been used to create the current Ukrainian victim rage identity around the pro-Nazi Banderists. That has been an important story that's been maintained to cultivate this romanticism of World War II Nazis in Ukraine that have been deployed more recently, right, for obvious reasons. Holodomor was a famine that had struck across much of the southern Russia, of which Ukraine did suffer, but it was a more like this famine. There were people in Russia as well that died, not just in Ukraine. And the thing about this is that the reason why there was a food problem, a lacking of food, was not that Stalin was just taking Ukraine food to feed his people inside of like mainland Russia or whatever you want to call it. It's that the Western, the Baruchs, the Warburgs, the victors of World War I had ensured a policy of grain repayments from Russia when the Bank of International Settlements had been created in 1930, that Russia would pay all of its debts, not with the gold, which it had in abundance, because Russia had a lot of gold. Mm-hmm. And there was an explicit contract written up by the League of Nations victors to tell Russia that the only form of debt repayment that it will be accepted by the USA, by Britain, the British Empire, will be grain, not gold. They did not allow gold. So they forced Russia into a situation where a famine was hitting at the same time as you have to pay your debts at gunpoint. Russia was still very weak. It was still like suffering desperately economically. There was still not a lot to stand on, not a lot of industry. The new economy policy had wiped out Russia's economy in the 20s, even worse than it had been already damaged after the Romanovs were overthrown. And the people who oversaw the stories of controlled famine that became the basis of these modern tales that we have become almost like sacred truths in our modern society are people like Gareth Jones, who was the first. He was the person, along with Malcolm Muggeridge. These two journalists were on the ground in Ukraine during 1933, writing journals and telling their editors of the horrific stories of Russian-controlled genocides going on through famine in Ukraine. Now, the thing about these two guys, one of them is the nephew of Beatrice Webb, the founder of the Fabian Society, Malcolm Muggeridge. And the Fabian Society, for those who have read my books, knows all about this. This is one of the controlling, influential, perverse hands of global technocracy and depopulation. And the other one, Gareth Jones, was the principal secretary to Lloyd George. Lloyd George was the Nazi prime minister, the guy who said to the Nazis, "I will be your Nazi prime minister if you victoriously capture Great Britain. I'll be your guy." He's the guy who worked with Milner in the Round Table. That was the Round Table prime minister. And so his personal secretary is the guy who's then sent in to make this story up with, again, no evidence. It's all just his journals. And that becomes the only evidence that the entire story is then built upon and built upon and built upon, that transforms itself from gossip in the 30s and 40s into increasingly sacred myths that everybody now has to orbit their brains around. And then when Stalin dies, that's when there's a complete like Khrushchev takes over, and that's it. I've seen enough evidence that has persuaded me that Khrushchev was a closet Trotskyist, and the whole network of Trotskyists who were found guilty in the Moscow trials. There's like 5 of them. They're all rehabilitated, and Khrushchev says, "Okay, Stalin, he lied about everything. He was a genocider," and Khrushchev starts what's known as the de-Stalinization campaigns, while at the same time he's bringing in Bertrand Russell, he's bringing in the Cambridge Five, the British, the spies from Oxford and Cambridge, who then go and transfer into Russia. They're all being brought in under Khrushchev to be made KGB controllers, like Lord Philby, not Lord Philby, Kim Philby. Anyway, and these become then the agencies that start controlling Soviet policy under the Cold War, and with them comes the introduction of cybernetics. Bertrand Russell's promotion of cybernetics, the idea of mathematical controls of world politics, becomes adopted by Khrushchev. It becomes a lot of the pro-Stalinist leadership is purged. Some are killed, some are just purged, kind of like what happened to Roosevelt. That's why Roosevelt and Stalin got along, because both Franklin Roosevelt, the president of America, and Stalin both understood that they had a common deep state trying to kill them. They both survived many assassination attempts. They both understood that they could really only trust each other. They couldn't trust Churchill, whose only purpose was to defend the British Empire. And they both had a common idea, despite their differences in political economy philosophy. They both had an idea that the world need to industrialize and end things like poverty, hunger, scarcity. But they were coming at it from 2 different philosophies.
Yes.
But they had a common opinion. And so Roosevelt dies, his enemies take over. The Fabians, the Rhodes Scholars, they take control of the U.S. State Department. They work very closely with the British to create the Anglo-American Special Relationship. They create the CIA. They purge the OSS. They create all of this stuff, right? And the U.S. starts acting more and more like an empire. But it's not the U.S. anymore. The U.S. has now been taken over like a pod, like a pod people. There's this other entity now controlling the U.S. from across the ocean.
Yeah.
It's happening to Russia. Russia is acting more and more like its own enemy, and it's playing into this game of divide to conquer, of grand British strategy, and the whole thing is losing its vitality. In China, same thing is happening. You have the Bertrand Russell devoted followers around the Communist Bolshevik Party in China. who believe in, this getting rid of religion, getting rid of the idea of God, of family, and just like going for total communalism, no property, and remaking the image of man in the image of some sort of a machine. It's satanic stuff. That you have that inside of China as well, just like you had that with the Trotskyists in Russia. But you also have patriots who are Confucian, who find themselves inside of the Communist Party as well as inside of the Kuomintang Party, which is sort of the pro-Western party of Sun Yat-sen. But you have agents and authentic nationalists in both parties who start, and you have traitors in both parties, right? Yes. Kind of like with the case of Israel today, right? And Palestine, you got traitors and honest people in both sides. So it's the same thing back then. And there is a fight after Sun Yat-sen dies. Zhou Enlai was one of Sun Yat-sen's trusted friends who realizes, with Sun Yat-sen's own wife, that the Kuomintang party under Chiang Kai-shek, who was the guy who replaced Sun Yat-sen, is morally bankrupt. They're working with all the warlords, all of the land owning mercenary operators who were created by the British in the Century of Humiliation. Those warlords are all now controlling the Kuomintang party, and a lot of them want to work with the Russian fascists, like the what becomes the White Russians. There's a Russian fascist party that's actually based in northern China at this time. They have a big they're very much tied in with the Theosophists as well, and the various Luciferians. It's very, very. I just found out about this too, and they want to work with the Japanese fascists, the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek. They actually are. They're a fascist party. Chiang Kai-shek calls himself the Generalissimo. He wants to be a fascist, but he can't fully embrace it because there are still patriots in the Kuomintang party who are like, no, let's not do that. The Japanese want to ultimately destroy us. You can't work with them, and so he finds himself trying to play both sides. The Communist Party, at the very least, is for the people. They're not for the warlords. And so a lot of the patriots around Sun Yat-sen end up becoming communists. And so you got these weird influences, right? You've got the Skull and Bones influence within China, the Bertrand Russell influences that always wanted to create a macro structure of technocracy and control. You have the same thing in Russia that maintains itself and gets back into a more dominant position after Stalin dies. And then you see it really come onto the scene in Russia in when the Soviet Union is dissolved, and now these technocrats just completely take over with the new billionaire class. But in China, that was sort of happening under Kissinger, and so there was the crisis that China faced in the early 70s was poverty. There was a lot of poverty. The century of the cultural revolution was, in my opinion, disastrous. It was a stupid policy, in my opinion. Some people have said that Mao had his reasons for doing it that are justifiable. It's not been proven to me that that's true. I think that it was based on trying to weaponize young people for political reasons and destroying ancient cultural sites and memories of Confucian and Buddhist traditions. That, in my view, that's never a good thing. That's never justifiable. So that did a lot of damage in my view. But when Mao dies and the Gang of Four is put in jail, there's a big emergency. Like, how do they end being in a third world situation? There's so much poverty still. There's so much despair and scarcity. So part of it is, well, Deng Xiaoping, comes on board. He's got a lot of problems too. He's not a good guy in any way, but these people are not traitors. See, these Chinese leaders, they don't want to do like what Trotsky wanted to do, or like
I understand. Yeah.
So George Soros is brought in in the 80s especially. But part of it is, okay, we need Western industry to help create the productive forces and to create a basis of training the next generation of producers. Learn the skills. We need to learn skills fast and leapfrog. So they start doing that, and they agree to become a cheap labor exporter for the rest of the world. And the rest of the world, under Kissinger's plans, will become consumer only. We won't produce anymore.
Yeah.
That's bad. Like right there, we lose our vitality. We lose the moral fitness to survive if we think that that's okay. But we do. We go along with it. We export our industries. China becomes that. We get cheap stuff. They get a bit of money, subsistence living, but it's still sweatshops. So in the 80s, there's a big fight. George Soros manages successfully to get one of his puppets to become the premier of China, named Zhao Ziyang. And Zhao Ziyang at the same very soon becomes the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party by 1987. That's the most powerful position in China, is now run by a guy who is the puppet of George Soros and who co-manages a open society think tank with George Soros, is now the head of China. You know, it's bad. It's so bad. And there's like Soros scholarships being given to talented young Chinese economists to go and train abroad and be sent back to be the technocratic managers. And Milton Friedman is touring China, giving lectures on how to run a liberalized economy. And all of this stuff is happening in the 80s. It's a disaster. But the Patriots didn't disappear either. What happens, though, and we go into this in the documentary, there's a moment in 1989, just as the Soviet Union is about to disintegrate and the Berlin Wall is being torn down, where the New World Order is about to be announced fully. Like the one world government is here, the game is over, end of history. And in China, part of this requires the purging of the remaining nationalists who want to save China. That requires a Maidan color revolution directed by the CIA. Just like what happened with the Maidan in 2014. That's what they were trying to do in China on June, starting in April, but it peaked in June 4th, 1989. And it was the thing known as Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square was not what we've been told. I thought, just like most people probably think this who are watching this, millions of people died, innocent protesters who wanted peace and democracy died by Chinese tanks. We've been lied to. In the documentary,
I'm sure we have.
Yeah. Yes. So Soros is, to make a long story short, check out my documentary for those listening and they want to know more about
definitely. This. And I'll have a link also in the description of the video when uploaded.
And that's where Soros is kicked out. So they maintain control. Soros's agent Zhao Ziyang is stripped of all of his power. He's put in house arrest where he dies 14 years later, never allowed to leave his house. Many of his colleagues either escape arrest through the U.S. Embassy and Hong Kong triads who help get them into the U.S. and Canada, or they go to jail. Some of them remain behind after they come out of Chinese jails. They are reintegrated and a lot of them become find themselves circulating what's called the Shanghai clique. So in Shanghai, which was the British domain of corruption for over 150 years, that's where you have the Shanghai billionaires. And it's called the Shanghai clique of these figures around Jiang Zemin, the Zhang family. The Li family is another one. There's many, but this is where people like Jack Ma is groomed as a teacher to become sort of a Bill Gates of China cardboard cutout who will promote transhumanism in China. Jack Ma is selected by the Shanghai clique, which has always been loyal to foreign powers. It was always the deep state center within China is there, and also I think Hong Kong are the two primary zones. Also, Taiwan too has been a U.S. controlled hub for a long time, obviously. But so this is where there's been a battle for the past, especially 12, 13 years since Xi Jinping came in. The battle intensified immensely between this clique and what Xi Jinping represents as a more authentic Confucian leader who has wanted to restore the proper heritage of China as a nation premised around the mandate of heaven. It's a Confucian idea that's tied to like what Augustine had also configured or wrote about as the city of God, and that the city of man is only legitimate if our laws that man creates are in concord with the laws of the city of God of heaven. And so in Chinese philosophy, going back to Confucius, that same idea is called Tiangmin. Tianming is the idea of the as the harmony above, so it must be the harmony below. And any emperor who does acts or passes laws that are out of whack with the law of justice in heaven, the people have a responsibility to overthrow said emperor who loses the mandate of heaven. And that's written extensively by one of Confucius's disciples, Mencius, who's very Platonic. Actually, when you read the writings of Mencius and you compare it to the writings of Plato, It's like, except one is writing in dialectical formats. It's the same philosophy, but one is like 150.
Mencius is Chinese.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He lived around the time of Plato, a little bit before Plato, but about the
It
same
sounds
time.
like a Greek name
Kind of does,
or
eh?
Latin. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, Mencius. Yeah, so this is what is has been revived. If you go to state like Chinese media, I always encourage people to go to, instead of reading about China from our local media outlets, which are very questionable and far removed from like what's going on in China, go to, like, China has English language media called CGTN. They also have African channels, European channels. Look, just don't believe everything they're saying, but just take some time to go to their channels, read how they're conveying their philosophy, their way of looking at the world. Watch their Netflix, like Netflix has Chinese shows, where you could watch, or on YouTube there's Chinese movies that people could watch with subtitles. Watch them just to get a sense of comparison of the
Of their
different way.
culture right now. Yes.
Yeah, like, get to know, immerse yourself a little bit in the current culture and see, well, what's different in the culture that we're being fed by Hollywood and the Western Netflix and all this stuff. Compare the difference and you'll see it. It's visceral. It's visceral. There is like a Confucian renaissance. So like Xi Jinping, not only has he cracked down, there's like been 4.7 million Chinese party officials who have been punished. Some have received long jail sentences for being foreign agents over the past 10 years. And we're talking like high level former two heads of Chinese intelligence, a former justice minister, high level operatives. So there's a real fight against the deep state. And I've looked at a lot of these key figures who have received the deepest punishments. These are really bad creatures. They're not like innocent victims being punished by evil Xi Jinping and the CPC. Like, no, these are actually the key players who had done the most damage for foreign interests around Jack Ma, who was the biggest transhumanist, World Economic Forum Satanist inside of China, as a Chinese Bill Gates, who was also taken down, right, in 2020 when he called for effectively an economic coup against the Chinese government around banking. And when he gave this open speech right when his a subsidiary of Alibaba was about to go public, he was really arrogant, and he basically said the whole Chinese banking system is all done stupidly. They don't do enough it's run like a pawn shop, he said. It's run like a pawn shop. And he basically called for a total reform around a decentralized banking system where it would be like little microeconomies, like what is Alibaba and Alipay is set up with social credit scores and everything associated with everybody's bank accounts. That's what he wanted. And he's been the driving force behind a lot of this stuff. And he was taken down. He was basically put in his mansion. People were like, did he die? I don't know. And for 3 months, he disappeared. He was stripped of all of his influence. He was told, you're allowed to be a high school teacher now. That's all he's allowed to do. He can still live in his mansion. He can still own money, but he can't have any influence. And he can only teach like high school. That's his only. So that's nice to see.
Yes, but because social credit system exists in China, maybe they just wanted, they didn't want him to be in charge of that, and they wanted, to be,
you know what?
They wanted to own.
I got to tell you something here on this. This is interesting too. But when you start scratching on the social credit story of China, like what is social credit in China? Again, it's one of these things where as soon as you start scratching on it, you start looking, well, what is this thing? It's completely different from what we've been told in the West. There are,
I don't know exactly because I haven't done a deep study, but because I work for Chinese, I work in a Chinese company.
Yes.
And I had one discussion like 1 or 2 years ago, I don't remember, with my boss, basically, who was here in Greece. And we didn't really go deep into the subject because of clearly we had to discuss business issues. But I did ask him, and he did tell me, first of all, I have to tell you that most Chinese people love China and they want to live in China. And yeah, they like the country and they like their ways. And so according to him, to my boss, they understand that in order to have this prosperity, because they have prosperity, they have money, they have technology, like high-tech technology, and this is how they grew up. I mean, this is how they know life is. They can't imagine here in Greece how far back in technology we are, and all these things. You don't have 5G and stuff like that, years ago. Anyway, but he told me there is a price to pay. Politically, he told me you cannot speak against the government, you will disappear. But that's okay. I mean, he told me, in every country, you gain something, you lose something. And for us, it's that we don't have much liberty, but we have, all these great things. That's what he told me.
Okay, what I've
And
been
he's all
yeah,
for his, I mean, he took his children from Europe
to go to
because
China, yeah.
to go to China because it was time for them to go to university, and he definitely wanted his children to go to a Chinese university.
Well, what I've noticed is that there is a variety of types of expression of social credit, and the primary type is for the corporate sector. So there is a corporate social credit thing, which is tied to trying to purge the deep state from China. Like, you got to keep in mind, there was about 70,000 foreign-funded NGOs operating across China throughout the 1990s, up until just a few years ago, up until around 2014. Many of them were CIA fronts. Many of them were religious organizations masquerading as CIA fronts in order to prepare the dissolution of China from within. And it involved multi-layers of cooperation, some low-level activism, right? Some lawyers being trained, as is always the case with color revolutions. A lot of it was in the corporate sector, though, which is a bit of like a very like, it's not as regulated as people think. Like, for most of the 90s, 80s, 90s, up until very recently, the corporate sector was like really quite a corrupt zone, and a lot of foreign money was coming in, and a lot of the greatest power to destroy China by foreign powers has been in the corporate sector. So there has been the social credit score for the corporate world is pretty high. That's one thing that I've been told, even from my corporate contacts. Some of them don't get it at all. They're angry and they hate China. Other ones get it. They understand, because they've done business. They've done the usual briberies to do business inside of China or outside of China. They know how it works and they get it. But so there is that. There is no such thing. And this is I could testify, like, I've spoken to so many people on the ground living in China. There is no mandatory social credit rating score that anybody has in China that you have to be in, that gives you like oftentimes on Epoch Times or a lot of the conservative media talking about this. They give off this impression that everybody has, like, whatever it is, 900 points, and you do the wrong search word, you say the wrong thing, and it goes
lose,
down,
yeah.
right? And
You
it's
lose
totally
points.
tied. Yeah, that there is no centralized such thing. There is a decentralized process. Like, China's quite decentralized, more than people realize. The provinces have a lot of autonomy. That's kind of like how the whole COVID thing operated. Was the provinces, the local governors of the various regions had more authority than the federal government, which is where you also had a lot of battles in courts between the federal administrators and the local governors, who were abusing their influence and power, forcing people to like, one region or one city had a district that somehow made an executive decision to kill puppies or like dogs during COVID.
Yes.
And then we were told in the West, see, that's what China's doing everywhere. You have to kill your animals. And it's like, no.
So you're saying that all these images we were seeing with people locked in their buildings and they weren't allowed to get out, that was, if that was true, and it was not a propaganda, that was a localized decision by local governors.
Yeah, there were localized decisions by local mayors and local governors to do various things, and we were not told about the disputes, the court battles that had occurred afterwards by the state and the local regions that to undo a lot of these things. The other thing is that we were also lied to a lot too. So the one thing I recently discovered by a close friend of mine, who made the point to me that it surprised me, but that I had believed that the images that we had been shown of, like, the doors being welded shut during the early days of COVID, that was contained within an entire province. I thought that was
city,
or an entire city. Yeah, I believed that. Now, what actually was the case, as it turns out, was we were shown these images. What we were not shown was that what those doors were the side entrances of a building, which these particular apartments in this one city, they wanted people to only leave through the main exit so that they could trace, they were doing their little testing your thermometer and
Get it.
stuff. So they wanted to be able to trace who was coming in and out of the main exit, and they didn't want all of the side exits around the building to be used as they usually were, so they welded them shut. And then we were shown those images, and then given the narrators of the West gave us a new contour to reframe the story of what was it about.
Yeah.
And we were told they were being left in their apartments to die of starvation.
Yeah.
And it's like it created an emotional felt memory, which even if it were admitted that was a lie, kind of like the stories of the decapitated Palestinian Jewish babies that we were shown images, or we were told about a few days ago, right? The Palestinians are cutting off babies' heads and drinking their blood. We were told this in the media, and then the same media outlets a day later on page 3 say, oh, that was actually never proven. It doesn't matter, because now the effect
everybody has that image in their heads.
Yeah, exactly.
So all right, to close with China, because I want to understand the connection with the Middle East.
Okay, I got a connection.
Yes.
So a big thing in China is the here's a one way I think we could tie it together somehow and sort of deal with another big trope. China, and I'm making a little video on this too with my wife. They've been sanctioned by governments of the world for Uyghur genocide of their Muslim population. That's what they've been. We've all been told they've been genociding their Muslim people, putting them in concentration camps, killing them. Okay, what's really going on?
I've seen the documentary.
Huh?
I've seen the documentary.
Correct. So there's once again, of a lot of illusion reframing of a lot of things that involves that story. The reason why there was ever a problem, because you got to keep in mind, China shares a border with Afghanistan. It's a 70-kilometer border. China has had, just like the U.S., a problem with Al-Qaeda. In the form of the Chinese versions, it's like a lot of the Muslim men and women, but mostly men, obviously, who've been living in Xinjiang since the 8th century. There's been Muslims living there. The reason why they became problematic, or many of them became radicalized and began acts of terrorism inside of China. There were hundreds of acts of terrorism, carrying out bombings, public knife stabbings from 2006 all the way to 2014. They were radicalized by this Zbigniew Brzezinski policy in the 70s to create radicalizing madrasas funded by the Pakistanis at the time and the the Saudis at the time. Right, for what we already talked about. Now, a lot of those men were from China. They were recruited. They were sent down to fight jihad and cut their teeth. They learned battle plans, mercenary skills. They even fought with ISIS. They helped overthrow Gaddafi and the Libyan Shield. They were promoted and supported by British and American intelligence the whole time. And then they were sent back to do the same thing inside of China, calling for East Turkmenistan to be created, to be carved out, where currently there is Xinjiang. They have, and even the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA front group that ran the Maidan and the Georgian Color Revolution 2003, and the current one that they're trying to do again, and the Armenian Color Revolution in 2018, that was again funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. They, on their own website, call it East Turkmenistan, not Xinjiang. They don't recognize China as China, just like they recognize Taiwan as its own sovereign country, which even the U.S. State Department recognizes that as part of China. So the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, has been utilizing front groups funded by the CIA to promote the story that China has been killing all of the Muslim men. Now, China, it's actually not the case. China, the part of what was done under Zbigniew Brzezinski is China was used to provide weapons, and there was even a CIA outpost in Xinjiang that coordinated the war in Afghanistan, that then cultivated and worked very closely with Muslim Brotherhood operations that were killing Anwar Sadat in Egypt and trying to take over as a global Muslim caliphate. That was being coordinated by a CIA outpost in Xinjiang in the late 70s and 80s. They were the one maintaining all the logistics supply lines, making sure that the young fighters would go to and from Xinjiang. And that is never brought up in these conversations. The other thing is China dealt with their terrorist-ish problems not by bombing any country, but by providing trade schools and training. When we are told in the West that China has destroyed all of these mosques, because there was 26,000 mosques in 2014 in Xinjiang, that's a lot of mosques per capita for a population like that. We've been told that they destroyed all the mosques, right? And that they put everybody in concentration camps. That's what we've been told. The information that comes out of that, when you look at the think tanks that produce the reports that are repeated by the UN, by different governments and media, the reports always say the same thing, that they used a data sample of about 340 satellite images of regions that they believe were mosques, and using this like data sample of 340 or 400 satellite images, comparing them from 2016 to today, they say that about 60% were either damaged or are no longer there. And then they say, we extrapolated out that sample of 350 to 400 to the whole 26,000, and we presume that the same proportion maintains itself. And thus we can say that 60% of the mosques have been destroyed. And then they say every building from our satellite images that we see that has like a fence around it is a concentration camp. When you actually look at most of the claims of each of the individual concentration camps that they say, they're either training schools where people on the ground who have been interviewed inside these very buildings are pointing out they're learning carpentry, plumbing, they're learning real skills that are being put to work when they go back into the world, and they learn like civics courses, Confucian philosophy, but trade. They're getting jobs building infrastructure, which is happening. You could take high-speed rail across Xinjiang. I can't even do that in the USA or Canada. So you got that. And a lot of these buildings are like factories. There's nothing even close to a concentration camp. They're factories or schools, and schools in Canada, most elementary schools have fences around them. If you look at a satellite image, you could say from the same logic that these schools, from a satellite's perspective, is a concentration camp. And if you ask a lot of kids, maybe the kids would say yes. But and so we're given this is the way the narrative has been repackaged to shape our zeitgeist around this idea that it's not the city of London, it's not these Freemasonic Templar orders that have been underground working with the Scottish Rite Freemasons, interfacing with British and Venetian intelligence, taking over our governments, trying to push a depopulation agenda. Don't look at any of that. Look at China, they're the bad guy. Look at the Jews, they're the bad guys. Look at the Muslims, they're the bad guys. Look at the Russians, they're the bad guys. So that's how we're being played. And so I'm hoping that through this dialogue we just had, people will focus a little bit on some of these subtle historic dynamics that help us just zero.
That things are not as as they present it. They present them to us. I don't believe that China is an angelic state, or it has an angelic government. Definitely not. But I can understand what you're saying. The propaganda.
Yeah,
Trying to paint, as you said, China is the bad, and the bad player, and everything that China does is bad.
I personally don't want to spend so much of the time that I do spend defending China, and I have more important things to do with my life, frankly. But unfortunately, because I could see what's happening and how there's just all of the unresolved, subtle, subconscious trauma that was put into our zeitgeist during the Cold War about, everyday baby boomer children were being told in the 50s and 60s the Kremlin and the Chinese commies are out to destroy us and kill us and take our freedoms, and nuclear bombs, and are going to kill us all any second of the day. There was a lot of trauma and a lot of propaganda that was created over a sustained period. And it kind of went away a little bit with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And we were told we can all breathe freely now, no more danger of nuclear war. The West and democracy won. So people kind of like the trauma went back under the surface. But because it was never resolved, it's like a hypnotic spell. All of our buttons are being played, like we're being played like a violin, and it's all being brought back. And you could just see good people from left, right, all agreeing. People who hate Soros agree with Soros. People who love Bannon hate Soros, and people who hate Bannon love Soros are all now agreeing on the same things about, like, Israel is totally to blame or totally at fault, or in this case, it's China is the enemy of the world, out to steal our freedoms, and Xi Jinping must be overthrown. And everybody's kind of like falling to the same beat frequency. And their Cold War ghosts are all coming back now again. And
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah, yeah.
you know what it is.
It is another Cold War, isn't it?
And it could get hot fast, like, because in the Cold War, we were not living on in an economic meltdown the way we are today. So in the Cold War, there was still a physical economic basis upon which the monetary system was built that hadn't been destroyed. Today, it's been atrophied so much that the bubble system has grown so big that it's more than a localized banking issue. It's a global systemic breakdown now, which is much more dangerous than anything we had in the Cold War. And it's coexisting with the emergence of an alternative new security financial paradigm with these different civilizational forces of India and China and Iran and Russia, and Africa is going through a Pan-African revival. And there's still a hope for a Pan-Arabic like revival of Nasser's dream of development in conjunction with this whole thing. So because of that tension, there's, I think, a greater danger of kicking over the chessboard when the oligarchy feels like they're running out of moves. But that means also the utilization of nuclear weapons, which makes me quite nervous. And certain religious fanatics who, like, when you unleash some of these fanatics out of the bottle, even the oligarchy can't control what they're necessarily going to do. Like, they've created some real Frankenstein monsters that when you unleash them, whether you got the radical Zionist or radical like jihadi groups or whatever, it's really hard to pull them back in. You really can't do it.
Yeah. Well, because I'm questioning the nuclear weapons thing. Even if they do not, even if nuclears are not in the picture, they still have chemical weapons. I mean, they still have technological weapons.
Weapons of mass destruction. Yeah.
Yes. Even if
There's
these are
space-based lasers. There's pathogens that can be released in all sorts of ways. There's all sorts of
I
things
don't
that
know,
can do
gases
damages.
and all sorts of
There's
really
a lot of ways
nice.
to blow things up.
Yeah.
So people have to really just, I think, look at some of the lessons of history where we were not tragic, where humans behaved in a wise way in accordance with natural law, and found a way to work together and overcome our differences by finding what makes us all human first. At which points oligarchs have lost their influence and power over us, and we got more out of the cave and out of the Shadowland. So whenever that happened, those are lessons that we should take to heart and do again today, and not fall into emotional traps that are being set for us.
Yeah. Okay. And to just briefly, because we're on for 2 hours now. You an hour and a half ago you said that there's no way that that Egypt warned Israel about Hamas. And I stopped you, and can you just return there and briefly explain why they allowed this to happen if they had the intelligence
Well, I
beforehand?
think it's the same reason why General Amos Yadlin wanted Hamas to become the dominant voice representing the Palestinian people back in 2007. It's because there are these radical Temple Mount crazies who want an excuse to do religious war against the Arabs and purge the Middle East of Arabs. They want the excuse, but that requires an enemy to fight that is violence prone. So they actually want Israelis to die, to be killed, in order to have the moral righteousness to go in and purge Palestine.
Like 9/11.
Yeah. Basically
So Matt, that means that the leadership, the head of the Mossad is radicalized.
It seems so. I don't know all the details yet. I haven't done
Amazing.
the deep dive work, but that's where the
Great.
evidence is pointing in my mind.
Okay. All right. What do you think? If you would bet to an outcome, Like not a lot of money, but an amount.
Okay, well, I don't. My mind isn't capable of responding to you that way. I can't do it. But what I can say is that I have my faith in our ability to navigate through this is premised on I think it's a reasonable faith that Iran is not stupid enough to get enmeshed in this quagmire, and neither is Saudi Arabia. They've both exhibited a lot of withholding and restraint, especially with a lot of provocation that especially Iran has faced with the murder of Suleiman and a variety of things over the last few years and many more years before that. And I believe that there is enough wits and wisdom on the part of these very important nations, and specifically I'm thinking again Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, those three big ones in the Middle East, to recognize that they have to withhold their feelings of revenge. They have to do their part to extend their influence over other Arab neighbors, to not fall into the trap of violence by endorsing an escalation that could easily in support of Hamas. There has to be, like, Putin has come forth with a very important call for acknowledging Palestine as a state for the first time. That has to happen. That has to happen. China has endorsed the same thing, but people can't fall into more violence outside of what's already happened. So I think that there is a beautiful vision for a positive future that these nations have been sold on, which is viable, is functional, and can work. And they seem to have a pretty decent sense of the tricks of the Anglo-Venetian American empire that has been trying to entrap everybody into forever kill each other wars. So that's my basis of hoping there. If I'm wrong, it doesn't matter what we gamble. I think that this could escalate so big, so badly that I don't even want to think about that.
Okay. I really don't want to let you go, but I'm gonna let you go.
Well, we'll do this again. I mean, we shouldn't wait another year. Let's do another one.
No, let's not wait another year, because I do believe that we're gonna have very fast, developments.
Mhm.
So I'll get in touch again. We'll see how things go.
Okay.
And I want to thank you so much for talking to me. I always learn a lot when I talk to you, when I read you, when I read your articles, because you somehow you always give the opposite perspective, even the alternative from other alternative perspectives. You are the alternative of the alternative. So
Thank you.
I appreciate that.
That's a great compliment. I appreciate that too, and thank you. And yeah, context is important. So I look forward to our future conversations.
Okay, definitely we'll do that. Okay. Matt, I'll have your links on the description, and if you can, because I'm not sure I'm gonna able to find it, will you please send me the link for the documentary you did with your wife about how China kicked Soros out?
My pleasure. Yes, I will do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would like to link it with the video. All right. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Talk soon. Bye bye. Thanks.